A man watching the sky die. The morning of July 25, 1944, broke warm and clear over Normandy, France. After days of rain and low cloud that had grounded Allied aircraft and delayed what everyone knew was coming, the sky had finally opened up. Summer light filtered through apple orchards and across fields that smelled of warm grass and old earth. In the hedgerow-carved countryside south of the Saint-Lô to Perrier's road, Generalleutnant Fritz Bayerlein stood at his forward headquarters and watched the horizon fill with aircraft. Not a few, not a squadron, thousands of them. B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators stretched from one edge of the sky to the other, wave after wave, formation after formation. Their engines are rolling thunder that started as a distant hum and grew into something that swallowed every other sound on Earth. Then came the medium bombers behind them, then the fighter bombers below. Nearly 3,000 aircraft in total. Bayerlein later said, the bombers came as if on a conveyor belt, each wave following the last with mechanical precision. And they were all aimed at the same rectangle of Norman countryside, 6 kilometers long and 2 kilometers wide, the sector held by Bayerlein's division. Fritz Bayerlein was 45 years old in the summer of 1944, and he was not a man easily rattled. He had served as Erwin Rommel's chief of staff in North Africa, standing alongside the Desert Fox through the victories at Gazala and Tobruk and the grinding defeat at El Alamein. He had commanded the 3rd Panzer Division on the Eastern Front, leading a breakout from Soviet encirclement at Kirovohrad against Hitler's explicit orders, a decision that required not only tactical skill, but the kind of cold nerve that comes from years of staring down impossible situations. He had faced British armor in the desert, American infantry in Tunisia, and Soviet T-34 tanks at Kursk. He wore the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, among the highest decorations Germany awarded. He had been wounded in battle more than once. But Fritz Bayerlein had never seen anything like this. What happened in the next 96 hours would transform the most lavishly equipped, most expertly staffed armored division in the German Wehrmacht, an elite force that Rommel himself had called the finest panzer division in the West, from a feared fighting formation into scattered wreckage spread across cratered Norman farmland. More than 70% of the men under Bayerlein's command would be killed, wounded, driven insane, or reduced to a dazed stupor by what was about to rain down from that clear July sky. And when it was over, Germany would have lost not just a division, but an irreplaceable reservoir of armored warfare expertise that could never truly be rebuilt. This is the story of Panzer Lehr, how it was born, how it fought, how it was destroyed, and what that destruction really cost. Germany's greatest war machine, the birth of Panzer Lehr. To understand what was about to be lost in Normandy, you have to understand what made Panzer Lehr so extraordinary in the first place. This was not a division that had simply accumulated veterans over years of combat. It had been engineered from scratch to be a demonstration of what German armored warfare could achieve at its absolute peak. The word Lehr in German means teach or instruction. The division began forming on December 30th, 1943, drawing its personnel primarily from the Panzertruppenschule, Germany's elite tank training schools. These were not ordinary combat soldiers who happened to have experience. These were the men who had survived the war's worst theaters, been selected from among the best performers, and then spent years teaching other men how to fight in armored vehicles. They knew the theory behind flanking maneuvers. They understood why certain terrain favored attackers or defenders. They had spent countless classroom hours breaking down complex tactical situations into lessons that green recruits could understand and remember. And most of them had gotten those lessons from personal experience in the most brutal fighting of the war, on the steppes of Russia, in the deserts of North Africa, in the mud and mountains of Italy. Roughly 60% of the division's original cadre had fought on the Eastern Front or in North Africa. Many had earned their decorations in the desperate fighting at Stalingrad, at Kursk, or in Tunisia. They were the survivors of the worst the war had produced, and they had been assembled in one place to serve as a model, a living demonstration of what German armored forces could become. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of German armored warfare doctrine and Inspector General of Armored Troops, personally oversaw the division's creation and hand-selected Bayerlein to command it, specifically because of Bayerlein's intimate experience fighting the British and Americans in North Africa. If Panzer Lehr was going to face the Western Allies in the anticipated invasion of France, its commander needed to understand how those opponents thought and fought. The equipment that came with the division was extraordinary by any measure of the war. Standard Wehrmacht panzer divisions moved their infantry in a mixture of armored half-tracks and ordinary trucks, the trucks being terribly vulnerable to artillery fragments, aircraft strafing, and even small arms fire. Panzer Lehr was different. Every single Panzer Grenadier battalion in the division traveled in armored SDKFZ 251 half-tracks. All of them. The division possessed more than 650 of these vehicles, more than double the number in any other German armored formation. In practical terms, this meant the infantry could keep pace with the tanks across fire-swept ground, could fight from their vehicles under conditions that would have stopped truck-borne troops completely, and could maintain the kind of combined arms momentum that separated elite armored warfare from a simple tank charge. The armor itself was formidable. As of June 6, 1944, the division fielded 208 operational tanks and assault guns, including 97 Panzer IV tanks and 86 of the new Panther medium tanks. The Panther was a 45-ton machine with a high-velocity 75mm gun capable of penetrating the armor on an American Sherman tank at ranges exceeding 2 kilometers. At typical combat distances, American tank crews faced almost impossible odds against a well-positioned Panther crew. The division's reconnaissance battalion drove the brand-new SDKFZ 234 Puma armored cars, 8-wheeled vehicles with 50mm guns that could outrun virtually anything the Allies possessed and outfight most of their light armor. Even the artillery was fully motorized and armored, capable of keeping pace with a rapid advance instead of being left behind on roads while tanks surged ahead. The average age within the division was 21.5 years, young enough to be aggressive, experienced enough to be smart about it. When the division completed its formation and training and was positioned near Chartres in the spring of 1944, it numbered 14,634 officers and men at or near peak strength. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, now commanding German forces in France and deeply familiar with elite formations from his years in North Africa, toured the division and called it the finest panzer division in the entire Western theater. There was, however, a weakness that some German officers noted quietly among themselves. Concentrating the cream of Germany's armor instructors, the men who trained the trainers, into a single division was a magnificent idea as long as that division survived. But if Panzer Lehr was destroyed, Germany would lose not just a fighting formation, it would lose an entire generation of armored warfare expertise in one blow. The men who knew how to teach others to fight in tanks would be gone, and there would be no replacing them. That concern would prove grimly prophetic. The long road to ruin, D-Day to St. Lo. When Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, Panzer Lehr was positioned near Chartres, roughly 150 kilometers from the beaches, as part of the OKW Strategic Armored Reserve, and critically, it could only be committed to battle with Adolf Hitler's personal authorization. This constraint existed because Hitler remained convinced that the Normandy landings might be a feint, designed to draw German armor away from the Pas-de-Calais, where he still expected the main Allied assault to fall. That authorization did not come on D-Day. Hitler slept late that morning, and his staff hesitated to wake him with news they weren't yet certain about. When he finally awoke and learned of the landings, he still dismissed them as a diversion. Hours passed. The Allied beachhead grew. Men and vehicles poured ashore. By the time the release order finally reached Bayerlein on June 7th, precious time had already been surrendered forever. The march to Normandy immediately exposed what would be a defining reality of the entire campaign in France. The Allies owned the sky. Royal Air Force Typhoon fighter bombers and American P-47 Thunderbolts prowled every road in France during daylight hours, attacking anything that moved. Bayerlein ordered his column to move at night when possible, but even darkness offered only partial safety. Roads were jammed with other units racing toward the front. Villages created choke points where vehicles bunched together, and Allied night fighters, guided by radar and flares, could still find targets. By the time the division reached the front lines, it had already lost 84 half-tracks and towing vehicles, 90 wheeled vehicles, and 5 tanks before it had fired a single shot in anger. The division was committed to battle near Caen on June 8, immediately placed adjacent to the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend on the British and Canadian sector. There was no time for rest or systematic reconnaissance. Allied pressure was too great, and the gaps in the German line too dangerous. Panzer Lehr was thrown directly into some of the most intense fighting of the entire Normandy campaign, slugging it out against British armored formations in the Norman bocage, a landscape that seemed almost designed to neutralize the advantages that had made the division special. The bocage was unlike anything most of the veterans had encountered in Russia or North Africa. Small fields, sometimes no larger than a tennis court, were enclosed by ancient earthen banks topped with centuries-old hedgerows, dense masses of intertwined roots and thick vegetation that rose 4 meters or more above the surrounding ground. A Panther tank trying to crash through one of these banks would rear up, exposing its thin belly armor to enemy fire. Commanders were forced to use the gaps that farmers had cut through the banks over generations, and every gap was a potential ambush site. An anti-tank gun could wait invisible behind a hedge and open fire from 40 meters away. By the time the tank crew saw the muzzle flash, there was nothing to be done about it. On June 13th, the Battle of Villers-Bocage gave the division a brief, spectacular moment of tactical success when Tiger tanks from the attached 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion, led by SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann, ambushed a British armored column from the 7th Armored Division and destroyed 13 to 14 tanks plus numerous other vehicles in under 15 minutes. The British withdrew from Villers-Bocage. But victories in the bocage came with costs that ground the division down, regardless of which side held the field at the end of the day. By the close of June 1944, just 3 weeks of combat, Panzer Lehr had suffered nearly 3,000 casualties and reported the loss of 51 tanks and assault guns, 82 half-tracks, and 294 other vehicles. The division that had entered Normandy as Germany's most powerful armored formation was already badly diminished. On July 1st, Panzer Lehr had only 36 operational Panzer IVs and 32 operational Panthers, roughly a third of its original tank strength. On July 7th, Bayerlein received orders to transfer his division westward to the American sector near St. Lo. 3 days later, on July 10th, he launched a counterattack against American positions near the village of Le Désert. American M10 tank destroyers and aircraft hit the attacking force hard, destroying 30 tanks in a single day and forcing the survivors back across the Veer Canal. The next 2 weeks were a grinding defensive battle, each day bringing more casualties, more destroyed vehicles, more ground conceded. St. Lo finally fell to the Americans on July 19th after savage street-by-street fighting that cost the attackers thousands of casualties. By the time the city fell, Bayerlein's division had been reduced to approximately 2,200 combat troops and somewhere between 40 and 50 operational armored vehicles. It was a shadow of the force that had rolled out of its assembly areas 6 weeks earlier, but the worst was still coming. Operation Cobra, Bradley's gamble. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley had spent weeks staring at maps of Normandy and thinking about a problem that was becoming dangerous. The Allied position in France, for all its momentum and promise, was beginning to feel like 1914 all over again. More than 1 million Allied soldiers had come ashore since D-Day, but they remained squeezed into a bridgehead roughly 50 miles wide and 20 miles deep. The bocage gave German defenders a nearly infinite series of natural strongpoints. The British and Canadians had tried 3 times to break through around Caen, Operations Perch, Epsom, and Goodwood, and while they had worn down German armor, they had not cracked the line open. Over 400 British tanks had been lost in Operation Goodwood alone. Bradley's plan was fundamentally different from everything that had come before it. Instead of pushing along a broad front, he would concentrate everything on a single, narrow point. Instead of hoping that artillery and infantry could dislodge determined defenders from their hedgerows, he would use something unprecedented, the full weight of American strategic air power, delivered in the closest proximity to ground troops ever attempted in the war. The plan was codenamed Operation Cobra. Bradley flew personally to England to argue for the support of the 8th Air Force's heavy bombers. He wanted a carpet of destruction laid across a rectangle of bocage roughly 7,000 yards wide and 2,500 yards deep, sitting directly across the Saint-Lô to Perrier Road. He wanted bomb craters touching rim to rim, communications destroyed, defenders killed or shocked into paralysis. And he wanted the bombers to approach parallel to the front road, flying east to west to minimize the risk of bombs falling short onto American positions. The target zone was not chosen randomly. Bradley had studied the German order of battle carefully. He knew that Panzer Lehr division held this sector. He knew that destroying Panzer Lehr would remove one of only 2 panzer divisions facing the American front. Without armored reserves, the German infantry line would have nothing to seal a breakthrough once the Americans punched through it. Poor weather repeatedly delayed the operation through mid-July. Conditions finally seemed favorable enough on July 24th, and nearly 1,600 aircraft took off from bases across England. But as the bombers approached Normandy, clouds rolled back over the target area. The mission was aborted, except that not all aircraft received the recall order in time. Some had already released their bombs. Payloads fell on American positions. 25 soldiers of the 30th Infantry Division were killed, and 131 were wounded. The attack had not even started, and Americans were dying from American bombs. Bradley was furious. Despite his insistence on a parallel approach, the Air Force had again flown perpendicular to the front, approaching from the north instead of the east. In the minds of the air commanders, the parallel approach was impractical for managing thousands of aircraft and would have spread the bombardment over too many hours. Bradley saw it as a failure of communication that bordered on dishonesty. But he had no choice. The Germans now knew a major attack was coming, and every day of delay gave them time to reinforce and reorganize. Cobra had to go forward on July 25th, or it risked losing whatever element of surprise remained. That night in his headquarters at Cannae, Bayerlein knew the attack was coming. German intelligence had intercepted enough Allied radio traffic to confirm that something large was being prepared. What he did not know was the scale. He had roughly 2,200 combat troops in the path of the expected assault, 40 to 50 operational tanks, and little expectation of rapid reinforcement. He ordered his men to stand firm and prepared for what he assumed would be a conventional infantry attack, supported by the kind of aerial preparation he had experienced before. He was entirely wrong about what morning would bring. The sky falls, July 25, and the 96 hours. At 9:40 in the morning on July 25th, the sky began to change above the German position south of St. Lo. 600 Allied fighter bombers swept in low across a 300-meter-wide strip of German strongpoints and artillery positions, their rockets and bombs tearing into the earth for 20 minutes in a systematic assault on the defensive infrastructure. Then, exactly as those aircraft pulled away, the heavy bombers arrived. 1,500 B-17s and B-24s, flying in formations that stretched from horizon to horizon. Each one carried several tons of high explosive. The target zone was 12 square kilometers of Norman countryside. Over the next hour, those 1,500 aircraft dropped more than 3,300 tons of bombs, supported by an additional 1,000 medium bombers and fighter bombers that added hundreds more tons of explosives and napalm. More than 1,100 guns of American artillery joined in with coordinated fire. 60,000 fragmentation and incendiary devices fell across a 12 square kilometer area, roughly 5,000 bombs per square kilometer. The village of La Chapelle-en-Jugé was erased. Other villages ceased to exist as recognizable human settlements within minutes. Bayerlein later wrote that he had never encountered anything remotely comparable in his years of combat. The bombers came like a conveyor belt, he said, back and forth, wave after wave, the bomb carpets rolling across the ground until artillery positions were simply wiped out. Tanks were overturned and buried under tons of displaced earth. Infantry positions were flattened, and every road and track in the sector was destroyed. By midday, the entire area resembled a moonscape, with craters touching rim to rim as far as any survivor could see. The effect on the men of Panzer Lehr was beyond anything that can be easily described in military terms.
All signal communications were severed. Command became impossible. Bayerlein reported afterward that several of his men went mad and ran out into the open while bombs were still falling, screaming and flailing until they were torn apart by fragments. Others survived the physical bombardment but were so deeply shocked, their minds simply unable to process what had happened, that they sat motionless in their positions, unable to respond to commands or even to recognize what was happening around them. More than 70% of Bayerlein's soldiers were, in his own assessment, dead, wounded, driven insane, or too deeply dazed to function as soldiers. Approximately 1,000 men were killed outright. Of the tanks that had been positioned within the target zone, the results were devastating. Panthers and Panzer IVs flipped onto their sides by near misses, others buried under the earth thrown up by explosions, assault guns swallowed entirely by craters. By the end of the bombardment, only a handful of tanks remained operational within the impact area. There was, however, a complication that the Americans had not fully anticipated.
The bombing had also created a physical obstacle course that slowed the advancing ground troops. Craters so deep and so numerous that Sherman tanks bogged down trying to cross them. Roads ceased to exist. Villages that had been landmarks for navigation were indistinguishable rubble. When the 9th and 30th Infantry Divisions moved forward at 11 a.m., they found themselves fighting for every crater and every collapsed wall against German soldiers who, despite everything that had fallen on them, were still fighting. Because Panzer Lehr had been built from men who were teachers, men whose entire professional purpose had been to instruct others in how to fight through adversity, the survivors applied those same lessons to themselves. Ad hoc battle groups formed around surviving officers. Anti-tank guns were dug out from under rubble, their mechanisms cleared, their crews ready to engage American armor. A handful of tanks that had been held in reserve outside the main impact zone started engines and moved toward the sounds of fighting. By the end of July 25th, the American 7th Corps under Major General J. Lawton Collins had advanced only about 2,000 meters, far short of what had been hoped. American commanders at all levels reported frustration. But Collins saw something that the frontline reports were missing. The German resistance, though fierce in isolated pockets, had no coordination behind it. There was no armored counterattack forming. There was no reserve moving to seal the breach. The defensive crust had been fractured. Collins made one of the most consequential decisions of the campaign. He ordered his armored exploitation force forward the following morning, not waiting for the infantry to secure a clean breakthrough. The 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions would push south at dawn and drive through whatever remained of the German front. By July 26th, American armor was moving through the devastated zone and beyond. By the early hours of July 27th, Combat Command A of the 2nd Armored Division, under Brigadier General Maurice Rose, had advanced over 12 miles, losing fewer than 200 men and only 3 tanks. The German front had been penetrated beyond any possibility of quick repair. By July 27th evening, the German 7th Army reported 7 separate ruptures in the line from east to west. Organized resistance was collapsing across the entire American front. Attempts to send reinforcements to plug the gap repeatedly failed. Units dispatched to the front were caught by American fighter bombers on the roads and destroyed before they arrived. Avranches fell on July 30th, opening the gateway to Brittany and the French interior beyond. On August 1st, General George S. Patton's Third Army was activated and began pouring through the breach. The dam had broken, and the entire French campaign was now transformed from static attrition into something much more fluid and lethal for the Germans. Hitler ordered a counterattack at Mortain in early August that failed catastrophically, and by mid-August, the German 7th Army was being encircled in what became the Falaise Pocket. The losses there, tens of thousands killed, thousands more captured, virtually all their heavy equipment abandoned, ended German military power in France as an organized force. Paris was liberated on August 25th. Bayerlein, for his part, spent the first days after the bombardment trying to piece together whatever remained of his division. He later reported that Panzer Lehr was, by the end of July 28th, finally annihilated. Its armor was gone. Its personnel were casualties or missing. All headquarters records had been destroyed. The division that had entered Normandy with 14,634 men and more than 200 tanks had been effectively destroyed in 96 hours. And that was not the only price paid on July 25th. The bombs that fell short of their targets, again due to the perpendicular approach that Bradley had argued against, killed 111 American soldiers and wounded nearly 500 more. Among the dead was Lieutenant General Lesley J. McNair, commander of Army Ground Forces, who had come to Normandy both as an observer and as part of an elaborate deception operation designed to convince the Germans that a massive second invasion force was still waiting to land at Pas-de-Calais. McNair was the highest-ranking American officer killed in combat during the entire war. His death was kept secret for weeks, specifically to preserve that deception. When he was buried at the Normandy American Cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer, no band played and no salute was fired. His gravestone remained incorrectly engraved until 2010, 66 years after his death, when Congress finally updated it to reflect his posthumous promotion to full general. What was lost? Legacy and the shadow of Panzer Lehr. Germany rebuilt Panzer Lehr. Of course they did. After spending a month refitting in the Saar region, the division received 72 new tanks, 21 assault guns, and replacement personnel drawn from training depots across the country. By November 1944, it was back in action, positioned as a spearhead for Hitler's Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. The rebuilt Panzer Lehr drove westward through Belgium toward the Meuse River, pushing through American lines that had been badly stretched across the Ardennes front. At one point, the division captured the Belgian town of Celles, reaching almost to the Meuse, tantalizingly close to the objective that might have changed the course of the war's final months. But it could not hold. Allied air power, once the weather cleared, hammered the overextended German columns. Supplies ran short.
The 2nd Armored Division moved to block the advance, and the 101st Airborne Division, besieged at Bastogne with its famous refusal to surrender, held the road junction that the German offensive needed to succeed. Panzer Lehr was pulled back, battered again, and eventually trapped in the Ruhr pocket in April 1945, where its remnants, by then a force of several hundred men and perhaps 15 tanks, surrendered to the U.S. 99th Infantry Division on April 15th. The rebuilt division fought bravely in the Ardennes, but the men who filled its ranks in November 1944 were not the men who had been there in June. The veterans who had accumulated years of teaching experience, who understood armored warfare at a conceptual as well as a practical level, who had survived the worst the war had offered in 3 different theaters, those men were dead or scattered across the cratered fields of Normandy. Their replacements were younger, drawn from an increasingly depleted German manpower pool, trained in abbreviated programs that compressed months of instruction into weeks.
They fought as hard as they could, but they did not carry the institutional knowledge that had set the original Panzer Lehr apart from every other division in the German order of battle. The Panzer Lehr that attacked toward Bastogne was the same division in name only. The destruction of Panzer Lehr also revealed something important about the nature of industrial warfare that armies have had to reckon with ever since. Individual courage, professional expertise, elite equipment, brilliant tactical doctrines, all of these matter enormously at the small unit level. They can determine which way a firefight goes, whether a position holds or breaks, whether a counterattack succeeds or collapses. But none of them provide protection against the concentrated application of overwhelming industrial force. Panzer Lehr's instructors and veterans had spent years accumulating knowledge and honing skills that made them genuinely exceptional soldiers. 4,000 tons of high explosives erased that accumulation in under an hour. Fritz Bayerlein survived. He commanded the rebuilt Panzer Lehr through the Ardennes offensive, then took command of the 53rd Corps in the final desperate months before Germany's collapse. In April 1945, he surrendered to American forces in the Ruhr pocket, one of hundreds of thousands of German officers who laid down their arms as the Reich disintegrated around them. As a prisoner of war, he proved valuable to the U.S. Army Historical Division, collaborating on detailed accounts of German operations from the perspective of someone who had commanded at the highest levels across multiple fronts. His manuscripts on the destruction of Panzer Lehr during Cobra became essential sources for understanding the campaign from the German side. He was released in 1947, returned to civilian life in West Germany, and went on to serve as a technical advisor on the 1961 film The Guns of Navarone. He died in 1970 at the age of 71. The Norman countryside itself healed, the way places do when enough decades pass. The bomb craters were filled. The hedgerows grew back. The villages were rebuilt. La Chapelle-en-Jugé, erased almost entirely by American bombs on the morning of July 25th, was reconstructed, and today stands as a quiet farming community. Very few visitors passing through realized that the entire village was reduced to rubble in less than an hour on a summer morning 8 decades ago. The Saint-Lô to Perrier road still runs through that same bocage country. Fields still divide the landscape. Driving it today, you would have no particular reason to slow down, no obvious marker to suggest that something decisive happened here. But it did. On that stretch of Norman Road, in the summer of 1944, Germany's finest armored division ceased to exist as a fighting force, and with it went something that could not be rebuilt from depot stocks or replacement drafts, the accumulated expertise of the men who had taught an entire generation how to fight in tanks, consumed in 96 hours of fire and thunder falling from a clear July sky. Operation Cobra broke the stalemate that had been strangling the Allied campaign since June 6th. Before July 25th, the advance was measured in yards at the cost of thousands of lives. After Cobra, Allied forces drove hundreds of miles in weeks, liberating France and pushing German forces back toward their own borders. The price of that transformation was paid in blood on both sides of the line, by the German soldiers who died under the bombs and by the American soldiers killed by their own aircraft on the same day. Eisenhower, watching the attack from Normandy that afternoon, returned to England that evening deeply uncertain about whether Cobra had succeeded. He had already decided, quietly, that he would never use heavy bombers in direct support of ground troops again. The lesson had been learned, but the tuition had been enormous. This is how history pivots. Not always on famous speeches or grand strategies drawn up around comfortable tables, but on moments like July 25, 1944, when thousands of aircraft darkened a summer sky over 6 kilometers of French farmland and Germany's finest armored division ceased to be. If this story connected with you, please take a moment to hit like and share it with someone who appreciates the detail behind history's turning points. Subscribing keeps you with us as we continue to explore the stories that shaped the Second World War, the ones behind the famous battles, the ones about the people who lived and died in them, the ones that deserve more than a footnote. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We have viewers from all over the world, and this community is something special. Thank you for being part of it.